welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Carrie Gillen.
And I'm Megan Figueroa. Whoa! Did not say my last name right. Figueroa!
That's your new name from now on.
What happened?
I don't know. The tongue works in mysterious ways.
It does. And we were just before we started recording talking about people eating on mic.
Yes.
On podcasts. And I just got so nervous. Oh, wow.
Weird. And also, kind of related to this email that we got from Bethany.
Oh, yeah.
She just wanted to thank us for our comments in our most recent podcast, which was at the very beginning of this month.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
About how it's possible, despite lots of trying, that some people just can't say names in the way the owner of the name wants them to be said.
Mm-hmm.
It really annoys me when people insist that unless someone is saying their name perfectly, then somehow they're not trying or they're being disrespectful, and oh, if only they tried harder, etc., etc. I say this as someone with a TH in my name. I get it. A non-native speaker of English, or other languages that actually have the sound, is unlikely to say my name the way that I say my name. But I get it. They can try all they like, but they can't. I mean, they can over time, but it's true. It's not going to be instant. But yes, we actually should try, because that's not being an arsehole/asshole. Oh, dialectal. But at the same time, respecting that some people just don't have that sound available is also important. And I think it's just as arsehole/asshole-ish to demand that everyone has the same amount of sounds available to them as you do. And I think there needs to be more awareness of this. Anyway, that's been on my mind since I listened to your podcast, and I want to thank you because it's so unusual to hear this limitation mentioned. Thanks, Bethany. Thank you, Bethany.
Yes, thank you.
And I also want to point out, it's not just the sound that we have. Yes, that's part of it. But also the sound combinations that we can have. So there are lots of languages where you can't have like certain combinations of sounds, and then another language you can, and it gets really hard. So yeah, we should be aware of this limitation for sure.
Well, it's where we see kind of this mock Spanish sometimes when we so Spanish likes vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant. So something like school, you might hear like a mock Spanish, like say like eschool or esprite, right, for Sprite, because like Sprite, that's like 3 consonants in a row. That's bonkers, right, for a lot of speakers of other languages. So yeah, that's where that comes from. That whole, if you hear someone perhaps making fun of themselves, which is fine, you can do that, or mock Spanish, a Sprite or a school, it's because of the way that Spanish really loves consonant vowel, consonant vowel. But yeah, and too, like I have the trilled R, but just sometimes it's really hard to say it in my own last name. So when I tell you can say Figueroa, I really mean it.
Yeah.
That's just how I say it 90% of the time.
Yes. Yeah, the school thing is interesting because both French and Spanish did not like the too many, like the S consonant at the beginning of a syllable, and they both inserted E.
Yeah.
And then the French deleted the S, getting you école.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whereas in Spanish it's escuela, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Anyway, there's a little bit of phonology snuck into this, not really
history.
phonological, and historical linguistics.
Yeah. My God, we are just Renaissance women. Speaking of Renaissance, no, this is not a good transition, but 2020,
just go with
a new
it.
decade. Come on, why not? Yeah, this is our last episode of the year and of the decade, if you're being like that and stressing everyone out.
Oh my God. Yes. Can I just interject for a brief moment? Everyone's talking about all the things they did in the 2010s, and it just makes me feel so bad because like so many kind of shitty things happened in this decade to me or to people that I love. And so it's like, I know there are some good things that happened too, but it just seems like, let's calm down a little.
I know. It's like, maybe I should start just like, define, let's see, how many anxiety attacks did I have in this decade?
Right.
Really,
right, exactly.
A lot.
Can we talk about the bad things and the good things?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. And so just like, you don't have to do it, but it is a good point to do a year in review. And this is we're at like 2.5 years, right?
Yeah.
We've been doing this for a while now.
Yeah,
I feel like we've had a lot of messages, but like some of our messages, well, ultimately don't be an asshole. The golden rule of treating people kindly.
Yes.
Some, depending on like the political context of where our world is right now and everything, some of the messages are more important or like more salient. Yeah. Salient is the word. What do you think lately has been your most salient message from the podcast? Or you know, like just linguistic discrimination as the general theme.
I think from the podcast it's the nuance that we sometimes lose on Twitter. So, you know, like Zach Jagger talking about like, yeah, it's better to try to pronounce words in a source-like way, but if someone else isn't doing it, then that doesn't mean that they're a bad person. You know, like just like trying to balance like being a better person and judging other people less. I think that's the best message that I have gotten from any of our guests, at least for this year. Yeah. I know. Well, and I mean, I can't help but just love the new with Ake, the be good and be kind. But I mean, love that. Yes, that's obviously relevant at all times. Yes. But I like what Zach's episode 2. What was that, between Iraq and a hard place? Yeah. The idea that, I don't know, the be good and be kind. So be kind in our assumptions too. I always try to bring like, okay, so who has traditionally been marginalized in this situation? But then, you know, sometimes I miss like, okay, you know, that makes some assumptions where I might not see some nuance of the non-marginalized, because I don't know in what ways they are marginalized, since they have not been traditionally marginalized you know, like Latinx people have, or whatever. Or at least within the United States, because sometimes things that things are just so different from country to country. Yeah. That it doesn't look like it's marginalized here, but if you go to a different country, it totally is. And so, yeah. Well, like French in Louisiana. French in Louisiana. Again, or French in Canada. Yeah. And then think about Spanish in Spain. That shit is not marginalized. Nope. you know. Or in like lots of parts of Latin America, it's the hegemonic language. And so it's like, yeah, it's complicated. It's definitely treated badly in the United States, though. And so we shouldn't pretend otherwise. Right. But yes, some of that will be lost in a discussion of a particular point, right? Yeah, so we're talking about Spanish in the Southwest. We're not talking about, again, Spanish in Spain, so let's not pretend that Spanish in Spain is struggling. No. or even like on the world stage, it's not struggling. It's a pretty major language in the world. Maybe 5th? I can't remember, but it's pretty big. Yeah, so... and we'll never pretend English is struggling. Nope. It is not struggling to function, that's for sure. Strugs to funk. Yeah, I just started reading Jonathan Van Ness's book last night, and he says strugs to funk in it, and that's why I was thinking about it. Oh, okay. Or writes strugs to funk. It's so funny seeing it written as opposed to said. Anyway, but yeah, no, that's nuance. Yeah, I guess 2019 has been the year of nuance. Yeah, I think so. I mean, we came in, you know, a year and a half doing some, like, more general messaging, and then, like, you just refine it. Yeah. I mean, we have sadly missed out on, like, all Asian languages, and we still need to do so much. Yes, I would love to talk about all of the Asian languages. There's not too many, but we could talk at least about some of them. I would love to. I mean, the situation... let's just take the 2 biggest countries in the world. The situations in India and China are both super fascinating. Yeah, so yeah, we definitely need to talk about that. Yeah, and especially since Indian English is so disparaged here, when we're like, they've been speaking English longer than many parts of the U.S. Like, yeah. Like Indian something English that I've been thinking about. Yeah, for variety, and it's got all these fun things about it, and yeah, it's just things that we don't remember. A lot of Americans think that America has this, like, I don't know, right to English. And I'm like, well, let's not forget about
how it got here, why it's here, how so many more people have been speaking it longer than we have.
Yeah, and all the other languages as well. Like, it's not just English we want to talk about.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So, I hope 2020 is less fraught.
I know.
But I know it's not going to be.
I know. At least we can be kind to each other.
Let's try to be kinder.
Yeah.
Particularly if someone has a variety of language that's more marginalized than yours. Mm-hmm. But also recognizing, as we said before, they might be marginalized in a way you don't recognize. So just try to be kind.
Yeah.
Except for Nazis.
Except for Nazis. Go ahead and punch them.
Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
We're really excited today to have our guest, Geraldine McAvoy. Geraldine is a PhD candidate at the School of Law and Government in DCU, which is Dublin City University. Her research focuses on the right to a fair trial under international human rights law for minority language speakers. Thank you so much for being here with us, Geraldine.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I'm really excited.
And so you're in Finland right now, but you're finishing up your PhD.
Right, yeah. So I emigrated here officially about 3 weeks ago, but I've been coming here on and off I did my master's here, and I've been coming here on and off for about 7 years now. So I really love it here, and my plan is to continue living here once I'm finished my PhD.
Awesome. And what is your master's in?
So my master's in international human rights law, and I did it in Åbo Academy, which is a Swedish-speaking university in Finland, which is the minority language of Finland. So I was obsessed with minority languages, from my undergraduate, which was in Irish and law. So I was a trained legal translator. And then I went to Åbo Academy and did my master's, and I focused on minority language rights, which was a really awesome place to focus on that because, they really understood what I was about. Being a minority language university, the only one in the country. Then I started my PhD then kind of on the same topic, but specifically focusing on the right to a fair trial.
Are you from Ireland?
Yes. Born and raised in Ireland, yep.
And what's your language background?
So I, like a lot of Irish people, I grew up monolingual. So my parents and my family speak English only. But everybody in Ireland is required to speak or to learn Irish in schools from the age of 5. So it's when we start school, mainstream school, we're required to learn Irish. And I'll be honest, the teaching's not great, so not everybody comes out of it fluent, and there's a big problem with that. There are these sort of summer, I guess you might call them summer camps, where you go to an Irish speaking area for 3 weeks in the summer, and it's immersion. And I did those 3 times in my youth. And they were the best thing ever for me. So I was fully immersed in this language that for me for a long time was non-existent. It was just sort of a school subject. And it was the first time that I saw it living. And since I started my PhD, I've been kind of interrogating my relationship with the language. And I have dyslexia. And it's not, from a linguistic point of view, there's no research done on it. But there is sort of some evidence to suggest that Irish would be a less deep language for people with dyslexia. So it would be might be somewhat easier to learn than, say, English, which is notoriously difficult for somebody with dyslexia. So I think I sort of found my home in Irish because it was the first time. And I've talked about this on our own podcast about how I sort of found myself at home in the language, and it was the first time that like the pronunciations weren't trying to like freak me out and trying to like trick me. So it was the first time that I felt like kind of not stupid in the language. And it was that sort of connection, I think, that I always had, that when I finished secondary school, which would be like high school, when I finished that, I kind of didn't want to leave Irish. So I took an undergraduate studying law and Irish, and it was like the best decision I ever made, because, you know, I got to go to Montana and teach Irish over there. It was so awesome. And then when I was there, I sort of interacted with other minority language communities, like the Blackfoot community in Montana, and was just so interested by these rights, and I suppose the people being erased from their own communities, and that part of their identity being questioned. And that's sort of how I came to be where I am today.
Oh, really cool. So tell our listeners what your podcast is.
Yeah. Shout out your podcast first before we get deeper.
So I'm a co-host on a podcast called Mother Folklore, which is a podcast about words, Irish words, and words from Ireland. That's our tagline.
I love it.
Nice.
So we do like a lot of different stuff about like learning Irish. We do it in English, and there's lots of hang-ups in Ireland about learning Irish and stuff. People are always saying, oh, it's really, really hard, and are really sort of nervous to talk about it. So I hope we create a little sort of nerd space for people who are going back to learning the language and feel comfortable about it. And then we talk about other like stupid stuff as well. It's not nearly as academic as your guys' show.
Oh, that's okay.
Please.
Like all podcasts about education are good,
sure,
as far as I'm concerned.
And it sounds like our listeners would definitely be interested in that. So
yes.
we'll make sure to put a link, to your podcast.
Yeah.
So you're saying that people are saying that Irish is hard to learn, but does not everyone go learn Irish in school from starting at 5?
No, so there's a really interesting history with it. So at our kind of independence in the 1936, is when we sort of we became a republic in that time. And there was a pushback to sort of separate our identity from British identity. And the way to do that, at the same time, there was a revival movement for Irish. So part of that was when we set up our own education system, Irish was mandatory. So there was a real push to learn Irish. I mean, you couldn't get a state job if you didn't learn Irish or you didn't speak Irish. So there was lots of sort of incentives that ended up kind of being barriers, and people ended up having a pretty negative attitude because, I suppose, of the teaching at the time being very much around corporal punishment and stuff, and people having negative associations with the language and negative associations with teachers. The teaching being very, very Catholic and very, very staunch. And so it's mandatory for everybody. You can get an exemption if you've been outside of the country. I think it's until you were 11. So if you moved after you were 11, you're not expected to learn the language. And then if you have a learning difficulty, increasingly there's talk about that being sort of abused, but I think that's a bigger issue about the difficulty of the education system rather than the difficulty of Irish itself, because people will often use dyslexia as an excuse. They're like, oh, how will the dyslexic students? And I'm like, hello, like if you just did some research on it, because what I'm saying is just my own experience, but and the experience of another dyslexic student might be different, but that research hasn't been done to say whether or not it's beneficial or not, because you can't get an exemption from, say, you have to learn another language, like, say, French or something. You're not going to get one of those for being dyslexic or having another learning difficulty. But just Irish, they're like, no, that's the tricky one.
And also, French is not as bad as English, but it's closer to the English difficulty than most other languages. So, yeah.
No, it's pretty difficult. In terms of, like, pronunciation, in Irish, there's 3 dialects. And if you know how to pronounce the vowel and consonant combinations, I mean, you're good. You know how to pronounce any word that you've not seen before. So that's not something that I have in Sweden. I'm learning a bit of Swedish, and I guess that's a little easier. And allegedly Finnish, but I haven't tackled Finnish yet, just yet. It's quite tricky.
Yeah. As far as I understand, Finnish is much more like you see a vowel, you know how it's pronounced. You see a consonant, you know how it's pronounced.
Right. They don't have spelling bees here because everything's really easy to spell.
Yes.
It's just like, why would you not know how to spell that word?
Right, exactly. Oh, so jealous. English is so terrible. The spelling system. The spelling system.
Yes, the spelling system is terrible. So we really want to have you on today to talk about language and justice, and how it actually turns out that there's a lot of injustice when it comes to language. And I want to start off with a term that I had never heard before. What is inequality of arms? Because I think that's kind of an interesting way to start. this?
Yes, so that's like the foundation of my research, the inequality of arms. So that's kind of like a really like hot topic in European human rights law. So we have a pan-European human rights court called the European Court of Human Rights that I'm really focused on. And there's an international court as well from the UN, but the Europeans are super into the equality of arms. So what that means essentially is that you can't have a situation where one side has like insurmountable power and resources, and the other side in a court case has like minimal resources and minimal power. And it comes from the really famous case is called the McLibel case, which was a case where two people were sued for defamation by McDonald's in the UK. And they were like these two people from like a Greenpeace-esque organization who were like standing outside one McDonald's in the UK, handing out like leaflets, flyers saying like McDonald's might be bad. And McDonald's sued them for like an insane amount of money. It was just these two people who had like no resources. And the case went on, I think it was the longest case in UK history. It went on for like 10 years. McDonald's had spent, and like the amount, I think it was something like the amount of a small country's GDP on their case, and these two people had like no funds. So that went to the European Court of Human Rights, and they said that's not fair. You have to give people aid and you have to help them when they have like not enough means. It doesn't have to be exactly equal, but it has to be somewhat that it's fair and that one person isn't completely inconvenienced by their lack of resources. And where that comes into my research is with language, because when you speak the language of the court, you are at an unbelievable advantage compared to somebody who doesn't speak that language, because you can communicate with your lawyer, you can understand, okay, you might not understand everything that goes on in a court because the language is particular to the court, but at least you have the facilities where you can ask your lawyer, or you can sit there and kind of take notes and maybe ask later, or the court will interact with you. But when you don't speak that language, you're very much reliant on the interpreter. Maybe your particular language background means that you've language deprivation, so you wouldn't understand some things. And where that comes into the equality of arms is I think there's an imbalance where there's one person who doesn't speak the language of the court, and they're not provided with adequate services to allow them to be on the same sort of pegging as the person who does understand the language of the court.
Well, and that's really important too. And you kind of, you said this. So like the jargon of the court, the legalese type of stuff that we think of, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about like, in the US, it would be English. English is the language of the court. Right? Is that like, that's a distinction,
Sure.
right? The kind of jargon that is specific to a court versus like what the language is being spoken.
Yeah. And I think that is an issue as well, that like the jargon is obviously really difficult for people, but I mean, you're still at an advantage when you speak English. I mean, your education level, your socioeconomic background is important, but you're still have the facility to understand that language versus somebody who's has all of that socioeconomic disadvantage, but then also doesn't speak the language.
So what laws are there in Ireland regarding the right to interpreters in court or interrogations or other interactions?
So it's a tricky question. I'm going to say none.
Okay.
But then I'm going to say some. So we have a couple of laws. So with Irish, I have a constitutional right to speak Irish in Ireland. So I have a constitutional right to speak Irish on par with speaking English with the state. Now, that does not mean that it happens. And that does not mean that it makes it easier, but I have that right from the Constitution. With ISL, which is Irish Sign Language, there is an act that came into place in 2017 and will come into force next year, which provides a bunch of rights for people to use their language before the courts and in education and in broadcasting. And it makes ISL an official language of Ireland. So previous to that, we had Irish being the first official language, English being second constitutionally, and now ISL is a third official language legislatively. So there's those two languages have like at least constitutional and legislative protection. Otherwise, there's kind of policies for interpretation. So if you are interviewed by the police, they are required to provide you with an interpreter if you don't understand or speak the language. If you go to court, you're required to be provided with an interpreter if you don't understand or speak the language. And that's from as I said earlier, the European system of human rights and then the United Nations system of human rights. So the standard is understand or speak, which I have a problem with because what the hell does that mean? And it's also quite sort of spoken language centric, which is problematic in itself. Oftentimes you'll have a case where a judge says to somebody, hey, you're Polish, you've been living in Ireland for 2 years, why don't you speak Irish? I'm not getting you an interpreter. And then you have all of that bias about what people should have with their language. I mean, I can order coffee in Swedish. I live in a little Swedish-speaking town. I can order coffee here, but I can't defend myself in court here. Not that it's ever had to happen, but you have oftentimes where it happens with the police as well. They might think that somebody is like just trying to like be awkward and evade justice, and think that we're not going to get you an interpreter because we think that you speak perfect English because we saw you chatting with somebody outside the police station or whatever. And that's not specific to Ireland because it's really stressful. Like being interviewed by the police, I'm assuming, is like super stressful, right?
Yeah, it's a totally different level of stress versus ordering food. Just totally different.
And I mean, just the idea that we wouldn't err on the side of caution when it comes to these things. Instead, that you have police officers assuming, you know, like, okay, suddenly all of a sudden they're like able to talk about proficiency as if they were trained in it or something. Yeah, that's really unfair.
That's so the thing. Like it's if you just erred on the side of caution and provided an interpreter. I mean, they're not paid well enough anyway for it to cost enough money. Like, so I don't understand. Like, if on appeal, if you get, you know, if you end up going to court and it's found in court that you weren't provided with an interpreter, or if you weren't provided with an interpreter in the first case and then it is appealed, you know, how much money is that going to cost in comparison to just providing an interpreter? And like availability of interpreters is another issue in itself. And it's not just in Ireland. This is like, I think anywhere I look, this is sort of a global issue that if you make the interpreters available, like, and make them paid well, and put systems in place that they can be used freely, then these problems sort of don't arise. And they make things fairer for other people too. So if you have that oversight for non-English speakers or non-majority language speakers, you will have the same oversight for other people too. So I think that's maybe something that people should, I wish people would understand more, but again, linguistic discrimination is always like the one that people never think of. It's really frustrating.
No,
yes,
right?
It is.
No. For some people, for some reason, people think it's like a legitimate concern that they're allowed to have about other people, or, you know, it's...
Yeah. Right.
I don't know, you know, I mean, it's why we have a podcast.
Yes. It's the whole point of this podcast.
It's like, oh, you're doing a thing and I don't think you know that you're doing it because I think you're a better person than that. In Ireland, Irish has, if we're like doing the hierarchy, it's at the top in government wise. Mm-hmm. Yet people will assume that you know English well enough, so they will try to do court proceedings in English and not give you access to interpreters in Irish. Is that a lot of what's happening here? Yeah, so it's a really weird situation that Irish is the first official language. And then sort of you get away with saying, it's not a minority language, so we don't have to provide for it for a minority status because it's the first official language. And it's the first official language, again, for those reasons that I mentioned earlier about like identity and separating an Irish identity at independence. What ends up happening is, I mean, I'm a fluent Irish speaker and I've got a degree in law and Irish. And if I was before the court, I would not speak Irish because I would be so afraid of the bias that would be against me. Because if it's a jury case, that whole jury know that I speak English because there's nobody in the country, I would suspect, apart from a very few, and I would say less than 10 people who are quite old and maybe speak only Irish, maybe in the west of Ireland. So for the vast majority, they are bilingual to the degree of English is often better because you have more resources and more content, particularly when it comes to things like sort of court speak that you might hear about it mostly on the news, so that you'd be familiar with those terms mostly in English rather than in Irish. So you will be provided with an interpreter, but that comes with problems too. So they will provide you with an interpreter if you seek one, or they're supposed to provide you with an Irish speaking judge. That doesn't always happen. The judges aren't always trained, and it would more likely happen in a Gaeltacht area, which is an Irish language speaking area. However, in my own research, I've done some research on it, and that's not always the case. There are some judges in those areas with incredible biases against people, even with just Irish language names, who have a complete bias against those people, which is so frustrating. And so you got to be really careful. And I think it would be in people who, from my research and from the data that I've collected, the people who take their cases in Irish are people who want to prove a point. So those are the people who want to make a stand on the Irish language, which is fine.
I don't know if I'd be brave enough to do it, because I always say when I'm doing these interviews with people that I've got the background, but if I'm like driving my car and I'm at like a random, they do those checkpoints in Ireland for like breathalyze you for like drink driving, or check for like tax or insurance or whatever. And I'm always terrified. Like, I mean, my car is fully insured and taxed, and I'm terrified, and I don't drink, and I'm scared. I'm like, oh, maybe somehow I've broken a law. I'm just scared of authority. So when I'm rolling down the window, in my head, I'm like, you should be the one, because you're so prepared. You should be the one that speaks Irish to this police officer. But I'm too scared to do it, because I'm scared they'll take my car. You know, they'll find something wrong with it and impound it, and then. And that's sort of a common. So I've got two supervisors, and one of them speaks Irish, and the other one doesn't. And the Irish speaker is like totally gets it. She's like, yeah, I'm too scared to speak Irish to the police too. You know, I would never do it because it would be so negative. And the other one's like, what the hell? Like, you both are Irish speakers. Like, doesn't really understand. But so I think there is that sort of, I mean, look, it's nothing new that there's problems in policing all over the world. Ireland is no exception. And, you know, some police are great, but the systems are pretty poor. And you have those biases coming into it. So yes, you can use your language in official capacities, but you better be prepared to wait or to suffer for it.
So it almost sounds like putting Irish at this top of this like official language hierarchy is posturing.
Right, yeah. And I think that's exactly kind of what it's become, which is really frustrating, because that's not how constitutional law is supposed to work.
Right.
It's really annoying, you know, that it's become this sort of like twee thing that people will say. There's a really good academic in Galway who talks about how people will speak in Irish at the start of a speech. So they'll say "Chorja," which is like friends or people, and they'll give their little few sentences, and then they switch to English. And that's kind of the status that Irish has. It's nice for like official ceremonies and stuff for the start, but then we switch back to English because that's the working language of the country. And I mean, that's a minority language, that's okay. But to have that, it's frustrating when even they provide the services, but the services are so poor or so negative to use that it's actually a detriment to use those services rather than a benefit, or even just the same. I don't want it to be a benefit. I want it to be the exact same as English, and that's not the case.
What is the message that speaking Irish sends to the police officer? What are they seeing or hearing when someone speaks Irish?
And that's such a good question. I haven't come to the answer yet. I have my own theories on it. So I have a couple of theories, and I think one of them might be to do with the fact that the Irish Police Service has an inherent relationship with, I suppose, the IRA and terrorism in Ireland and terrorism in Northern Ireland. And for a long period of their history, their sole purpose, or their major purpose, was protecting against terrorism. And a large part of the IRA's sort of mandate would have been the Irish language, because it demonstrated something that was incredibly Irish. So when you're living in Northern Ireland and you have all of this British rule, Irish represents something that's different, and it represents something that's truly Irish in their eyes. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that point of view. I think Irish is for anybody. But there is an association with the IRA and Irish. And I think one of their major slogans, which is Chucky Garlow, which is "Our Day Will Come," would have been something that they painted on walls, and they said a lot. So perhaps there's that association. A lot of the people who were arrested during the like major parts of the war in Northern Ireland would have spoken Irish on the jail blocks so that they could communicate in secret to each other, so that the jailers couldn't understand what they were saying. And so I think that might be an association. Then I also think perhaps on a sort of very meta level, I think people are suspicious and scared of the other, and the other person, particularly when they know that that person speaks English. So they know I speak English, because nobody doesn't speak English. So they are suspicious of my reason for using this language and see me as a troublemaker. And you see that narrative in like a ton of countries. I've done some research on it, and you see it in the United States. Spanish speakers, people assume that you're just doing that to make trouble. You've lived here your whole life. Needless to say that person has probably lived in a Spanish-speaking community their whole life, and their preferred language, particularly under a stressful situation, is Spanish, and they have that right. And then I also think there's those negative associations with Irish that I mentioned earlier from school. People have bad opinions of it. I mean, the police in Ireland are mandated to learn Irish, a certain level of Irish. So they're supposed to be able to say something along the lines of like arrest you in Irish, or like get your name and details in Irish, or at least tell you enough that they can contact a colleague who does speak Irish better. That doesn't always happen. I hope that it's getting better. I don't have any evidence to suggest that it is, but I would hope that it would be getting better and people would have a more nuanced understanding. But we have our own problems in the policing service in the recent years, so maybe they're not as focused on Irish language and linguistic justice as they ought to be.
Right. Yeah, there's always more things that you can be worried about. But they're connected. Language is connected.
No, I'm like, exactly. I'm like so struck every time that we have a guest who explains like their country or their community's history, how it plays out in language. Like, like to think about the there's just years and years and years of conflict and strife and all of that go behind choices, language choice and all of this. I see how this becomes very much a thing of identity.
Sure.
So do you know of any cases where someone insisted on speaking Irish in the court?
Sure. So from my own research, I have a couple of examples of people being arrested and the police legitimately saying, like, without sort of hesitation, I'm arresting you because you're speaking Irish. And I have cases where people gave their name, which is an Irish language name, and they were arrested on foot of that because the police officer wanted the English translation. So what is your name in English? And that happens to me all the time. And people assume that my name is a translation because there's this nuance of when we go to school that your teacher will give you an Irish name, so that people will assume that my name was Geraldine and then I became Geraldine, and then it's just sort of stuck. So sometimes people will call me Geraldine, which really grates on me because that's not my name.
Yeah.
And they just sort of take liberties with Irish names because they don't do that with like non-Irish names, which is, my partner's got a Finnish name, and when he's in Ireland, people don't say, what's your real name? What's your name in English? Which is so annoying. But so in terms of the court, there have been a few cases where judges have refused an interpreter to say, sorry, you're not getting an interpreter, or you don't get to speak Irish here. Some cases that are currently ongoing. It kind of happens less, I think, in the courts because there's more of an oversight in the courts. So if you are going to be the judge who says you're not getting an interpreter, that's going to get printed in the papers. Whereas if you're the police officer who doesn't have a body cam, we don't have body cams in Ireland, and you're on the side of the road at like 3 a.m. in the morning and somebody starts speaking Irish to you, there isn't an oversight. So I have one side of the story. I don't have the police side of the story. And imagine if I got the police side of the story, I would have a very different story and I'm not saying untruthful story, but you have got a party line to sell. So you're not going to sell out the An Garda Síochána, which is the Irish police, whose name is in Irish, by the way. We call our police Garda Síochána, which is like a whole other thing. When it gets to court, there is problems and there's delay, I think, is the major problem, that if you try to speak Irish, you're going to be waiting 2, 3, 4 years to get your case heard because it keeps getting pushed back because that judge doesn't have Irish and the judge should have Irish. They can't find an interpreter. Tons of sort of like annoying legal problems like that it's going to be like months and months and months, even years before you get your case heard.
I was not expecting 3 or 4 years. That's beyond.
Oh, minimum.
That is beyond. Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. You'll be waiting such a long time. I mean, there's a huge backlog in Irish courts anyway. We have problems with that, but because it's such a small country, that we kind of have a pretty centralized like court system. So for a major case that has to go to the High Court, you could be waiting, years for it to come before the court, let alone if you chose to speak Irish for it. And that's another thing I think I've been interrogating with my research, because initially I thought, these are two different groups. I'm studying deaf people and I'm studying Irish speakers. One has a choice to speak English and one doesn't. And the more I interact with it, the more I'm like, it's actually not a choice. For anybody I spoke to, an Irish speaker, for them it was not a choice. This was the only way that they were going to interact. Yes, they understood the English, but speaking English was not a choice for them. Which I think I had a really kind of, one person said something really beautiful, that for them it was like marriage vows almost, that they said that it was, they were going to be with the language in sickness and in health, in the good times and the bad. They were never going to not use the language, which I thought was like the most poetic thing ever. And which I thought was really kind of brave as well, because they knew it was going to be negatively affect them, but they did it anyway, because if they didn't do it, who would? Who was going to use the language? And then eventually they would, the fear with a lot of people would be, if they didn't do this, the services would be cut, and then people in the future couldn't do it. From statistics, it was from a statistical point of view. If they didn't do it, then no one would do it, and then they would cut the funding, and then we'd have no Irish.
So there is government funding that goes toward these services.
Yeah, there is government funding. It doesn't always go to the most sensible areas. And I think sometimes it goes to places and I'm like, did anyone ask anybody who has expertise in this area about it? So there is government funding, and that's something that people in newspaper columns on a Sunday like to complain about all of that funding and we spend on road signs when it's not that much money. So there's this assumption that there's all of this money to be had in Irish and all of the money is spent on translation. And I'm a trained Irish language translator. I can tell you none of the money is spent on translation. People just have this weird, I think we're an easy scapegoat because we're this community that speaks Irish that can also speak English and we're seen as a little bit strange. So it's easy to sort of like take punches at us. But I mean, we're used to it and there's amazing work being done with the language. So it's not going anywhere, despite how many people like to say, like Welsh, that it's a dead language. Like, what am I speaking if it's a dead language?
Yeah, it's definitely not a dead language. No.
So, will you tell us a little bit about, am I saying this right? The O'Mason versus Ireland?
Oh, O'Maughlin versus Ireland. Sure.
Did not say that right at all. I'm so glad that you were here to interpret for me. Okay, how do you say it again?
O'Maughlin versus Ireland.
Okay, yes. So O'Maughlin versus Ireland. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. This is like, I'm such a nerd. This is I have two favorite court cases. One is the Manitoba language rights case from Canada. And then this case, I love these cases.
That is pretty nerdy, but I know. I totally appreciate it. I love it.
So this one was about a person who was accused of a crime. I think there was like a bar fight or something in Connemara, which is an Irish-speaking region of Ireland. And he was set to be tried for that crime. And Mr. O'Maughlin was an Irish speaker from an Irish region, and an Irish-speaking region. I think he was from Rossmuck, which is like a pretty Irish-speaking area. And he was going before the High Court, and when you're tried for a criminal trial in Ireland, you're entitled to have a jury. And much like the US system, it's almost verbatim that you are entitled to be tried by a jury of your peers. And in Mr. O'Maughlin's eyes, his peers needed to be Irish speakers. So he was going to conduct his case in Irish, as was his right. And he wanted that case to be completely in Irish, to not have to have an interpreter interpret everything for the jury, because the jury are the ultimate arbiter. They're the ones that are going to convict you guilty or innocent, guilty or not guilty. It went through the courts. It was rejected by the courts for various reasons. There was a suggestion that there should be a specific jury pool set up of Irish speakers, that those would be, when there was an Irish language case, that those would be the ones from whom you would select a juror. But it was rejected. There's a really good dissenting judgment from Justice Hardiman, which is my favorite judgment, because I'm a super nerd. It's really, really good. And I think he died recently, and I think it was even mentioned in his obituary. They mentioned that particular judgment because it was just, so cool. Unfortunately, it wasn't the leading judgment. So he had said some really good stuff about how, it was the only country in the world where your official language was not the spoken language, and you have an official language, but you can't get any services in it. He was saying things like, there was some like really interesting comparisons about how interpretation might be akin to hearsay evidence, because it's not what the person has said, it's an interpretation of what the person has said. So when we give a warning for hearsay, should we give a warning for an interpretation? All of this really interesting stuff. There's lots of reasons why it might be problematic to have a jury who are Irish speakers, mainly because the language community is really small and like really connected. So like it's really hard to find like many levels of separation in an Irish language speaking community. Like we all know each other. So that might be problematic in itself, to find 12 people who don't have an opinion about you previously, who don't know you, might be really, really difficult to do. But it was a really sort of landmark case where it was kind of one of the more recent cases where language rights was discussed, and unfortunately not vindicated in the way that I would have liked to have seen. In that case, there was a lot of sort of mention as Irish being a sort of a decorative language rather than an official language, as it is, which I think is a frustration of the Constitution. I think you're just willfully ignoring what is written right there in the Constitution, which is really, really frustrating, because they don't do that for other things. They're really, really, really sort of strong on accurately and appropriately interpreting the Constitution.
The whole jury of your peers thing, that is just... I was thinking about this before we talked to you. Like all day I was thinking about how like so many injustices are in the court at so many levels. And the whole jury of your peers is a really big one. All these assumptions that people make about the defendant based on their identity and their language, how is this truly a jury of our peers when you, I don't know, it just power differentials, all of these things. And so that must really be happening to the people that decided to speak Irish in courts.
So much so, because for the most part, the jury, where even if you get a case where the judge and all the barristers and solicitors, they all speak Irish, so the whole case is being conducted in Irish, and then you've got 12 people, when it's a criminal case or a case relating to defamation, there's going to be a jury. And those 12 people, the likelihood is they don't speak Irish, or I don't speak enough Irish to follow the case. And they know that I, the defendant, don't speak English perfectly. So they know that I'm doing all of this just because I want to, in their eyes, and just because I'm being awkward or trying to frustrate the process or whatever, trying to get away with something because I'm speaking Irish, because somehow that might let me get away with something. So they're waiting for the interpreter. There's a delay. Everybody talks, then the interpreter interprets, because we don't have booths or anything. So they're waiting on that interpreter, and I think interpreters are amazing. I think they do an amazing job, but you lose so much in interpretation. You lose tone, you lose syntax, you lose, sometimes just concepts and words are not translatable in the same way. And then an interpretation is made on a split-second decision. The Irish language interpreters are pretty good, but you're already taking a risk to use the interpreter, let alone the fact that the jury is going to be biased against you. There's going to be nobody doesn't have an opinion about this. And, court cases are really boring to sit through. Maybe they're already annoyed about the fact that they have to sit through this case. And now they have to wait on the interpretation. And I was just saying to a friend of mine yesterday who came, an Irish speaking friend who was visiting Helsinki, and she was saying that we were talking about how, I'd love to get a study into jury rooms. There's no way that it would be allowed. They're really strict on not letting. Even recently there was the first case where a deaf person was allowed to serve on a jury because there was a problem about letting a 13th person into the jury room in an interpreter. So that was recently changed. So for the first time in 2017 we had a deaf juror. But I would love to get a study into biases in juries, because we sort of accept it in common law jurisdictions that juries are the norm. But I think generally they're problematic, and people have linguistic biases. And I think it's even more dangerous when they don't know they have linguistic biases, because they will ask you at the start of the case, do you have a bias against whatever? And people will alert themselves, but everybody's got a bias. And if you're not honest about the bias that you have, or you don't realize it, that's when problems can start to arise. And that's when those people don't even realize that they have a bias.
Yeah, I think with language in particular, most people don't know at all. They might know if they're super racist. A lot of people don't know that they're diet racist, but particularly if they're only sort of racist through language and they don't have all the other racist ideas, they don't know. They just don't know.
They've never had to really interrogate the situation around them, because they're probably speakers of the quote unquote mainstream dialect.
Mm-hmm. And you don't even have to be, right? Because you can be a part of one community and be racist against another one. There's all kinds of bias throughout.
Sure, yeah.
I guess, so you brought this up when we were, you were emailing earlier about how actually you might even need different interpreters in different situations. So if you're using the same interpreter with your lawyer and in the courtroom, there could be problems. So what are those problems?
Sure.
Why would that be
an issue? Is a really interesting issue that comes up a lot, particularly with smaller, lesser spoken languages. So if you have somebody who's a really obscure language speaker in some place, and there might be one interpreter, or a person who's going to act as an interpreter because there's not even training for that language, you might be pretty limited as to the person that you can use. On an interpreter level, burnout is a huge thing. So you should be changing the interpreter every half an hour, 20 minutes. That does not happen anywhere. Conference interpreting is actually pretty good. Sometimes they will, and the International Criminal Court, they're the top tier of interpretation. They're awesome. They're so good. But when you have a situation where an interpreter is used so say you have somebody who's arrested and they speak, they're a minority language speaker, and they go to the police station and they are interrogated by the police. So that procedure happens as an interpreter there. So lots of things are said there that maybe don't end up in court or maybe are superfluous information, but nevertheless are said during the course of the interrogation. And that interpreter is privy to all of that information. Then you have a situation where, okay, it's going to go to court. This person is being prosecuted for it. So that person has to hire a lawyer. So they hire a lawyer and they go and consult with their lawyer. Their lawyer is a majority speaking lawyer. They don't speak the same language, so they need an interpreter. Then you have an interpreter in that situation, which is even more problematic because the interpreter's heard everything before. Whether or not they know it, they are privy to certain information that may or may not come out in the consultation, which is fine because usually the lawyer will have access to tapes and stuff of the consultation, of the interview in the consultation. But what is said in the consultation is protected by lawyer-client privilege. However, there's a huge issue as to whether that interpreter is bound by lawyer-client privilege. So can you subpoena the interpreter and ask them what was said in the client consultation? I don't know of any cases where it's happened, but there's kind of a sort of a gray area on whether or not it could happen. I think professional ethics would say that an interpreter shouldn't do that, but not every interpreter is like bound by professional ethics. In Ireland, we don't, the professional ethics that interpreters have are like non-existent, with the exception of Irish Sign Language interpreters who are like amazing and have like professional degrees and stuff. That's not the case for most interpreters. And then when you get to court, you know, is that information that came out in the consultation going to come out in the court? And by way of an example, a good friend of mine is an ASL interpreter, so an American Sign Language interpreter, and has worked in a lot of cases in the United States. And she was explaining to me that there was some case about, I would think it was a car accident that happened. And there was an interaction where one car crashed into another car, and it came at the car from a particular angle. And I think the question in the court was, you know, did your car hit the other car? But the way that was signed was such a way that it had prior knowledge of the way that the intersection was. So it was a particularly sort of unusual intersection. It wasn't like a crossroads. It was kind of like a diagonal. Roads met at a diagonal intersection. And it was only through prior knowledge that interpreter could have known exactly what intersection was being talked about. And so they signed because they previously knew. And my friend was working as an ASL consult for the defense. And she noticed, she was like, hey, that person had prior knowledge. That person must have worked previously. And the person, in fact, was perhaps the interpreter at the police station. And so I think they had to change the interpreters because that person had previous knowledge. So it comes out a lot in signed languages where that sort of information needs to be coded in. You can't just say something like, did you hit the defendant? You need to put in force, you need to put in time, you need to put in where on the body, what part of your body you hit with, you know, what kind of a slap it was, whether it was a punch or a slap or a kick. So saying things like, did you open the window is like really problematic in signed languages because you need like what type of window, how difficult was it to open? You need all of that for sign languages. So it can be really problematic with those languages. It can really interfere with the fairness of procedures. But then from an interpreter point of view, interpreters very often don't get prior information. So they need to prepare. If they know that they're going to be talking about certain topics, they need to have that terminology at hand or like refresh themselves a little bit. And so very often lawyers will be quite like jealous about their documents. They're like, no, we're not giving you anything in advance. So the interpreter can only do their job so well if they're prepared. So oftentimes a really good study that I read by Kate Waterhouse, who's an Irish researcher, she did a research on the district courts and interpreter usage. And all the interpreters were saying that they loved when they were the same interpreter for the police station and the courts because it meant that they had some prior knowledge. And like most of the time they don't get prior knowledge. So they meant that they could do their job more effectively. So there is sort of conflicting interests there, whether or not your interpreter is adequately prepared versus whether or not your rights are being vindicated as a defendant.
Yeah. I mean, this is a matter of people's lives too. I mean, legal interpretation. Wow.
Sure. And I think that's the issue that I had the most trouble with, that I know there are cases where people have gone to prison on faulty translations. I know that they've happened. There's been cases in the United States where it's happened. I have, there was a Time magazine article about a case where there was it was a drug case relating to a Spanish speaker, and the Spanish speaker said, "Man, I don't have 10 cents." And that was interpreted as, "Man, I don't have 10 kilos." And then the judge said, "Oh, that's 10 kilos of cocaine, prison,"
Oh, wow.
And I think there happened to be a Spanish speaker in the audience who was like, "Hey, no, that's not what he said." But otherwise, how many of these things go amiss? I mean, I know court cases are recorded, but how often are they checked? How often do people go through the transcripts with an interpreter or a translator and say, "Hey, that's not what was said"? And I don't think that happens very often.
I mean, even when it's just all in one language, all in English, there are the things are not transcribed correctly. There have been times when the tapes and the transcription totally do not match.
Sure, yeah. And that's even more problematic than when you have a deaf person, because unless there's audiovisual interpretation for both the interpreter and the deaf person, you're not getting what was said. It's just whatever the transcriber or the stenographer took down. I mean, or if it's audio recording as we have in Ireland now, it's just whatever is spoken. You don't get what is signed. And that's so problematic. And if you include video recording, which is obviously more expensive, but it improves things for everybody, because sometimes audio isn't enough. I mean, there's nuance to the way people say things. Or, I mean, I transcribed all of my interviews, which was like awful. Which I hear you guys talk about transcription all the time. It was like I hated myself after it.
I'm not good at it.
Oh my goodness. And I remember transcribing it and reading it back and thinking, no, I mean, that sounds like this one thing, but I know that they meant that sarcastically, or I know that there was something else in that, or I know they were really upset talking about that. So you need to put that in, and that's lost, I think, when you have just transcriptions and audio as well. You lose some of that. So if you improve it for the minority, you actually improve it for everybody.
Yeah, as always.
Right?
As always. Well, it is getting late here.
Sure.
And I'm sure you have
a full day ahead of
to
you.
get to.
Full day of PhD work ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you have like one last message for our listeners?
I don't know. Don't discriminate against people's languages, please.
Yeah, right?
I don't know. I think
simple and sweet.
if there's anyone who has any sort of power to like change things on a societal level, then sure, please do that. Get in touch with me. I got a lot of ideas. Otherwise, I'm not so sure.
Okay. Well, we always leave our listeners with one final message. Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole. Oh, can you say it in Irish?
Exactly what I was going to say.
So you would say, "No be the botherlawn." Don't be an asshole.
Oh, okay, so that's like a literal translation?
Yeah.
Cool.
Don't be an asshole. Botherlawn is like asshole, or like, yeah.
And thank you so much for talking to us about all of this.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. I couldn't sleep last night. I'm so excited about it.
I mean, what can we say? We're like Disneyland.
Disneyland for language associated people.
Yes. Thank you so much, Geraldine.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at VocalFriesPod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.